Hello, and thank you for joining us for this Navigate Tuesday tip. I'm Pam, and today we're going to talk about alcohol and drug use and what you can do to address issues that arise at your community. Alcohol and substance abuse are a fairly significant issue in the United States. In a 2023 National Survey on Drug Use and Health, they discovered that among Americans 12 years of age and older, about 17% battled a substance abuse disorder, and a little over 10% battled an alcohol use disorder. The issue of addiction spans all races, genders, ethnicities, religions. So it is a pretty diffuse and significant issue, and it is going to impact us at housing communities. Associated issues when you're talking about substance abuse and alcohol abuse can include both physical and emotional issues. Health issues can include things like increased risk of cancer, skin disorders and infections, cirrhosis, strokes, liver and kidney issues, and mental health. And social issues can include things like negative impacts on family and marriage, other relationships, loss of housing, loss of job, and a stunted emotional growth. Alcohol and substance abuse are also seen as risk factors for eviction. This is largely because of some of those issues we talked about just a second ago. Alcohol and substance abuse can result in job loss or economic strain, criminal behavior, violence or disruptive behavior, and self-destructive tendencies or damage to property, which means it can impact somebody's ability to comply with a lease. We get concerned about something that's going to impact evictions because of the significant financial cost of your average eviction. Assuming a 2 to 3 month eviction process, you could be looking at up to $500 or more in court costs, potentially tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees. And then you also have the associated costs of vacancy loss and unit turnover. There were just over 1 million evictions filed in the U.S. We've found that one of the best things you can do when you're talking about avoiding evictions is effective screening. Past behavior predicts future behavior. And when you look at a resident who has been evicted, they have nearly 3 times the historical rate of prior issues than an applicant that has never had an eviction. So past behavior predicts the future. HUD, again, requires you to reject for an eviction in the last 3 years for drug-related criminal behavior, any member of the household who is currently engaged in illegal use of drugs, and any member whose use or pattern of use of alcohol poses a potential risk to your tenants. HUD strongly encourages you to consider mitigating factors, but you're not required to. Some of the things you probably want to consider are things like, if the person has a history of, alcohol use or substance abuse and related criminal behavior, are they sober now? Have they had treatment? How long has it been since those issues occurred? Is the person that has the issue no longer part of the household? Is there a VAWA issue that now has resolved? Or the seriousness of the offense? For instance, if I had a minor possession arrest when I was 18 and I'm 30 now, it's very likely that that's not an ongoing concern if nothing else indicates to you that I have remaining substance abuse concerns. You also may need to look at the need for a reasonable accommodation or modification if somebody is telling you they have addressed their substance abuse disorder, or if it's something like someone who was unmedicated when the behavior occurred, they have a disability, and now that disability is being effectively managed. That could be a reason for you to reconsider their application. But the owner agent sets what mitigating factors they will consider, and those should be set down in your selection plan. One of the things that can get confusing for people is what exactly is an issue when you're talking about alcohol or substance abuse that is a tenancy issue, a lease violation. For instance, if somebody drinks every day and they're always drunk, just drinking is not a reason for eviction. You're looking at things that interfere with the ability of management to run the property, that interfere with other tenants, or significantly financially impact the property. So you're looking at things that violate the lease. Drug use is always an issue, and that includes marijuana, even if it's legal in your state. When you're talking about HUD housing, marijuana is a federally controlled substance. Use of it is always going to be an issue. When you think you may need to evict for alcohol or drug use, consult with your supervisor or your attorney for whether you can or should evict and whether you have sufficient documentation. So marijuana use in federal housing is still a topic of debate, but the rule is right now, regardless of state law, use is still prohibited in any form, whether it's medicinal or recreational, and whether it's legal in the state. It is not a reasonable accommodation to allow someone to continue to use marijuana, even medicinal, in your property. You have a little more discretion when you're talking about a tenant. HUD says that if you discover that a tenant is using, you have the discretion on whether or not you're going to evict. Doesn't mean it's okay, but it says you have the discretion on whether you're going to move forward with an eviction. So some of the considerations are, what form is the person using it in, and does using it in that form violate the lease in and of itself? And does their use disturb others? So if I have a tenant who is smoking marijuana on my property and it's a non-smoking building, that's not acceptable. Smoking anything is not allowed on the building. But if I have somebody who's, say, using gummies, that generally is not going to disturb others. And eating a gummy in and of itself is not a lease violation. Now, a THC gummy, yes, but it's not something like smoking where the very act itself is going to violate the lease. One important thing to note, though, is if you are not going to evict, you are not saying it's okay for the person to continue using. You're simply saying you decline to evict. So you're not moving forward with an eviction, but it's not okay that they use THC on your property. You want to avoid saying anything that implies that you're allowing them to use. You can just let them know, HUD says that you cannot use marijuana in federal housing, but at this time we are declining to evict you. Or you could say to them, well, marijuana use is not acceptable at this property. You're smoking, which is also not acceptable. If it's necessary and you can use it in an alternate form, we will decline to evict. You just never want to say that it's okay. All of these things should be looked at with an eye on HUD's specific language. There's should versus may versus must. HUD says you must screen and reject for certain conditions. So things like a history of drug-related criminal behavior and presence on a sex offender registry. They say you should do certain things. That means recommend but not require. And may means that the owners can set their own policies as long as they don't violate HUD guidelines. For instance, HUD requires me to reject for presence on a lifetime sex offender list, but in my selection plan, I could say any presence on a registered sex offender list means I'm going to reject, whether it's lifetime or 10 years. So you do have some leeway for that, and it's up to the owners and agents to set those. And it's also up to the owners and agents to set what mitigating circumstances you're going to consider. Also remember that when HUD is saying you may evict, for instance, you may decide to evict or not with a tenant who's using marijuana, that does not mean that the state will grant the eviction. So sometimes state law and HUDs will conflict, and you should always be consulting with your supervisor and your attorney about whether an eviction is feasible or recommended. Safety is the most important thing for you at your property, safety of your tenants, and safety of your staff. And when you're dealing with somebody who may be abusing alcohol or substances, it can present a danger to any individuals that encounter them. Do not directly confront ever an agitated individual, especially if you believe they're under the influence. And be aware that in states where marijuana use is legal, especially when recreational use is legal, police may not be able to assist you. If somebody's just smoking and you smell smoke in the building, that's a lease condition. In a state that marijuana is legal in, it may not be at all a police matter. Manufacture, growing, sale, that is generally a police matter. Any other related criminal behavior that's associated with it, or any threats to themselves or others, absolutely. And when in doubt, if you feel you need law enforcement to address the situation, call them. They would much rather come out for something that turns out to be minor than not come out when you need them. Some of the important things to do when you're talking about legal action or law enforcement: document everything. Document, 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 document again. You want to make sure that you're noting who, what, where, why, when, date and time, who was there, who's writing the note, exactly what happened. You also want to make a note of, if you're writing a note on what you observed, who else was there. Be aware of surveillance and recording laws. Make sure that if you have security cameras at your property, that they are not recording sound if they're not supposed to be recording sound. Make sure that everyone at your property is aware of what surveillance systems are in place. You should have signs and notifications to people when they're on camera. And one of the most important things to do is to be firm and press charges when appropriate. If there is an issue that is a lease violation and you called the police out, you want to be pressing charges where it's appropriate to do so. You don't have to be unpleasant, but you should be firm and consistent. You also want to support residents in being an active part of safety at their community. Any safety measures that you put in place are going to work much better when the residents are invested in seeing that their community is safe. Encourage them to press charges where it's appropriate, but don't make promises. Don't promise that you can evict someone, because we all know that once you get into court, anything can happen. Educate and make your residents aware of the protections. Make them aware of VAWA. Make them aware of the rules on marijuana use. Involve your RSC where it's appropriate. If you have a resident who was the victim of domestic violence on the property, make sure that if you have an RSC, you're involving them and providing support to that resident. And make your expectations and the lease and a house rule expectations very clear. What can be really hard about this is we're not therapists. We can't force someone to get help. And although we might know somebody would be a great tenant if they'd stop drinking, we can't make them stop drinking. The RSCs can make referrals, but they're not therapists either. And unfortunately, you have to realize that some people never get sober. Some people never stop drinking. Some people never stop using drugs. And our concerns, our prime concerns, are the lease and HUD compliance, the safety of our residents. We're not there to judge morality. It's not, for me, about whether I believe use of marijuana is correct or alcohol use is correct or proper. It's about lease compliance. People have the right to make bad choices in their life, and you have the right to decide you're going to use drugs. You just don't necessarily have the right to use it on my property. So it's about the lease compliance. It's not about judging them as a bad person. And we always want to make sure that when we're talking to them, that comes across. We're not saying they're a bad person. We're just saying that the rules here have to be followed. And they have to be followed for everybody. So make sure you are enforcing those rules consistently and fairly. So key takeaways when we're looking at this: effective screening is your best tool to reducing evictions. Screen effectively for the issues that are going to disturb your residence or indicate a failure to comply with the lease. Marijuana use prohibited in HUD housing in any form, but you do have discretion as to how you handle it with a resident. Depending on state law, you may not be able to look for the police to support an issue with somebody using marijuana on the property. HUD recommends consideration of mitigating factors with your tenant selection plans. So if you will look at a history of treatment or you'll look at time since somebody's offense, you need to make sure that's in your tenant selection plan. Never, ever, ever put yourself in danger to confront an individual who's suspected to be under the influence, especially if they are agitated or violent, and call the police when needed. If somebody is yelling and screaming and making threats, call the police. So that's going to do it for today. We'd love to know what you would like to see on the next Tuesday tip. Please let me or Vicky know what you'd like to see, and we'll do our best to get it to you.